It's coming! Run! Woo!
I never thought I'd be telling you about two men stumbling down a mountain in nothing but torn pants and socks, their skin blue from frostbite, after watching 43 of their friends disappear in seconds. But that's exactly what happened on Lenin Peak in July 1990, and what you're about to hear will change how you think about mountains forever. Picture this. You're lying in your tent at 17,400 feet, the thin air making every breath a struggle, when suddenly the entire world turns white and violent. The ground beneath you isn't ground anymore. It's a churning, roaring beast of ice and snow moving faster than a freight train. In those first terrifying seconds, you don't even have time to scream. That's what 45 climbers experienced on the night of July 13, 1990, on what locals call the Frying Pan, a camp so safe it hadn't seen an avalanche in 30 years. Lenin Peak sits like a massive sleeping giant at 23,400 feet in Tajikistan, right where the Soviet Union once kissed the borders of China. Back in 1990, this wasn't just any mountain. This was the proving ground where Soviet climbing legends were born. The mountain had earned a reputation as the safe 7,000-meter peak, the kind of place where even beginners could taste the thin air of the death zone without, well, dying. The irony of that reputation would become crystal clear in the most horrific way possible. The summer of 1990 was supposed to be different. Dozens of the Soviet Union's finest climbers had gathered here, not just for glory, but for survival of another kind. They were preparing for Everest, and Lenin Peak was their final exam. Among them was Vladimir Balaburdin, the first Soviet climber to conquer both Everest and K2, a man who knew death intimately and had somehow convinced it to let him pass. If this mountain was good enough for Vladimir's approval, it was good enough for anyone. But something about that July made Vladimir's survival instincts scream. After reaching the Frying Pan camp, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He turned around and headed back down, taking just two others with him. Elena, one of those who descended with Vladimir, felt sick halfway down and decided to stay at a lower camp, promising to meet them later if she felt better. She never got that chance. Up at the Frying Pan, 45 souls settled in for what they thought would be just another night on the mountain. They shared stories, checked their gear, and drifted off to sleep with dreams of summit glory dancing in their oxygen-deprived minds. They had no way of knowing that hundreds of kilometers away, deep beneath the Hindu Kush Mountains, the earth was about to shrug its massive shoulders. At 6:49 p.m., a magnitude 6.4 earthquake struck over 200 kilometers underground. The climbers felt nothing, but the glacier above them felt everything. Imagine a skyscraper made of solid ice, balanced precariously on the mountain's face for decades, suddenly given a gentle but fatal push. That's what happened when one of the seracs, those towering vertical chunks of ice that mountaineers fear more than altitude sickness, broke free and tumbled into the fresh snow that had been accumulating for days. What followed wasn't just an avalanche. It was nature's version of a nuclear explosion made of ice. A wall of destruction nearly a mile wide and several stories tall began its terrifying descent toward the Frying Pan. The sound alone would have been deafening, like 1,000 freight trains screaming down the mountainside at once. But the 45 climbers sleeping peacefully in their tents heard almost nothing before the world ended. In less than 10 seconds, the entire camp vanished. Tents, people, equipment, dreams, everything disappeared under thousands of tons of moving ice and snow. The force was so immense that it didn't just bury the camp, it relocated it. Imagine trying to find a specific grain of sand after someone has rearranged an entire beach. That's what the rescuers would face in the days to come. But this isn't just a story about death. It's about what the human spirit can endure when everything civilized gets stripped away. Two men, just 2 out of 45, somehow survived that initial impact. Alexei and Miro had been camping near the edge of the Frying Pan, and instead of being buried alive like the others, the avalanche grabbed them like an angry giant's fist and hurled them down the mountain. They tumbled and rolled for 800 meters. That's half a mile of bouncing off rocks, ice, and each other, before being launched off a 25-meter cliff into a snowbank below. When Alexei regained consciousness, he was wearing nothing but torn pants and socks in sub-freezing temperatures at over 15,000 feet. His tent had been ripped away, his gear scattered across the mountain, and his body was a map of cuts and bruises that would have sent most people into shock. But shock was a luxury he couldn't afford. The cold was already reaching into his bones with icy fingers, promising death within hours if he didn't act. That's when he saw Miro, half buried in the snow nearby, unconscious but breathing. As Alexei pulled his friend from what could have been his frozen grave, they made a discovery that would chill them more than the mountain air: the legs of another climber, buried so deep they couldn't even attempt a rescue. They were alone, practically naked, and surrounded by evidence that their friends were dying beneath tons of ice just meters away from where they stood. Here's where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, but I need you to understand something about hypothermia. Your body doesn't just get cold and die. It fights back in ways that seem almost supernatural. When your core temperature drops, your blood vessels constrict, your heart rate slows, and your brain starts making decisions that would seem insane under normal circumstances. That's exactly what happened to Alexei and Miro. Instead of trying to descend the mountain to safety, they made a choice that saved their lives. They climbed back up toward the camp they'd just been thrown from. The logic was brutal but sound. Going down meant certain death from exposure during the long descent. Going up meant possible shelter, possible gear, and possible survivors who might help them. So these two broken, half-frozen men began one of the most harrowing climbs in mountaineering history, ascending through churned snow and debris, following the destruction back to its source, hoping to find salvation in the place where they'd nearly died. When they finally reached what remained of the frying pan camp, what they found was a scene from a frozen hell. The landscape had been completely transformed. Where there had once been orderly rows of colorful tents, there was now just an irregular plain of white snow hiding unimaginable tragedy beneath. But they could hear voices, muffled, desperate voices calling from under the snow. Some of their friends were still alive, trapped in their sleeping bags, buried under several feet of heavy snow that had already begun to harden into ice. If you've ever tried to dig through packed snow, you know how exhausting it can be under normal circumstances. Now imagine doing it while suffering from hypothermia, with broken bones, at 17,000 feet, where every breath gives you maybe half the oxygen you need. Alexei and Miro tried, but the mathematics of survival were working against everyone involved. The people buried below needed air within minutes, but digging them out would take hours that Alexei and Miro didn't have before they themselves froze to death. But here's what desperation and the will to live can accomplish. While the heavier items, bodies, oxygen tanks, cooking equipment, had sunk to the bottom of the avalanche debris, lighter items had floated to the surface. Pieces of torn fabric, clothing, sleeping bag material. It was scattered across the snow like a grotesque yard sale. Alexei and Miro gathered every scrap they could find and wrapped themselves like mummies, creating layers of insulation from the remnants of their destroyed camp. They spent that night pressed against each other for warmth, listening to the voices below them grow weaker and then fall silent one by one. By morning, the only sounds were their own labored breathing and the wind whistling across the mountain. They were the only survivors in a tomb of ice, and they still had to find a way down a mountain that had already tried to kill them twice. The descent that followed was something out of a survival nightmare. Dense fog had rolled in, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. They were essentially blind, walking barefoot through snow at altitudes where commercial aircraft fly, with broken bones and frostbite setting in. They developed a system that sounds almost childish but kept them alive. They threw snowballs ahead of themselves and listened to what they hit, using sound to navigate when sight failed them. Think about that for a moment. These two men, broken and freezing, reduced to throwing snowballs like children playing in a park, except the stakes were life or death with every step. One wrong turn, one missed crevasse, one moment of lost concentration, and they'd join their friends under the snow forever. By 7 that evening, Miro couldn't continue. His body had simply reached its limit, and despite Alexei's encouragement, despite everything they'd survived together, his friend was dying. Alexei faced a choice that no one should ever have to make: stay with his friend and die together, or leave him behind and try to find help. He gave Miro every warm piece of clothing they'd salvaged and promised to return with rescuers, then continued down the mountain alone. Alexei later said that what kept him going during those final hours wasn't thoughts of family, or glory, or even survival. It was the simple desire to have a glass of lemonade. Sometimes the human brain, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, fixates on the most ordinary things imaginable. That glass of lemonade became his holy grail, his reason to take one more step, then another, until finally, impossibly, he walked into the arms of the rescue team that had been searching for survivors. Vladimir, the experienced climber who descended the day before the avalanche, had organized the rescue effort immediately. When they found Alexei's tracks leading back up the mountain, they knew someone had survived the impossible. Alexei's rescue led them to Miro, who was pulled from the mountain barely alive but still breathing. Out of 45 people who'd gone to sleep that night at the frying pan camp, only 2 walked away. But the mountain wasn't finished with its victims. This was 1990, remember, the final days of the Soviet Union, when resources were scarce and technology was primitive by today's standards. The avalanche had created a mass of snow and ice so dense that it froze solid overnight, turning the burial site into something like concrete. Rescuers arrived with shovels and found themselves trying to dig through what might as well have been a glacier. They recovered only 4 bodies initially. The rest, 41 people with families, dreams, and stories that will never be told, remained entombed in the mountain. It would be 18 years before the glacier began to melt enough for more remains to be recovered. In 2008, Alexei returned to the frying pan as a guide for Peter Chedrin, whose father had died in the avalanche. It was Alexei's first time back since that horrific night, and he was able to recover some of the climbing equipment they'd left behind, physical proof that the nightmare had been real. Among the 43 victims were 23 members of the Leningrad Mountaineering Club, 6 climbers from Czechoslovakia, 4 Israelis, 2 Swiss mountaineers, 1 Spaniard, and Elena, the woman who'd stayed at the lower camp because she felt sick, only to be caught by the avalanche as it continued its devastating path down the mountain. If you think that's where this story ends, you're wrong. Lenin Peak had more horrors to reveal, and the mountain's reputation for being safe was about to be shattered by an even more tragic tale that happened 16 years earlier. But what happened in 1974 wasn't about avalanches or earthquakes. It was about human ambition colliding with nature's absolute indifference to our dreams. Her name was Elvira Shatayeva, and in 1974 she was one of the most accomplished climbers in the Soviet Union, maybe the world. At 36, she held the title Master of Sport, which in the Soviet system meant she was literally a national champion, and she had to prove it every 4 years or lose the title. But Elvira wasn't just accomplished. She was revolutionary. In an era when women were often seen as unable to handle extreme mountaineering, she was leading all-female teams up some of the world's most dangerous peaks. When American climber Molly first met Elvira at Lenin Peak's base camp, she described her as a strong, bossy blonde woman ordering around 4 large Russian men. Elvira pointed to an injured climber and barked orders for people to help him, then turned to Molly and said with typical Soviet directness, "I am Elvira Shatayeva. I am a master of sport. What are you?" It was 1974, the height of the Cold War, and here was a Soviet woman who had become a hero to American climbers. That's how legendary she was. Elvira's plan for Lenin Peak wasn't just ambitious. It was historically unprecedented. Her all-female team wasn't just going to climb the mountain. They were going to traverse it completely, going up one side and down the other. No all-female team had ever summited Lenin Peak, let alone attempted a full traversal. The technical difficulty wasn't the problem. It was the logistics. A traversal meant spending extended time at killer altitudes, carrying all their gear to the summit, since they wouldn't be returning the same way they went up. Her husband Vladimir, also a master of sport and trainer for the Soviet Mountaineering Federation, watched from base camp as his wife led her team up the Lipkin route in late July 1974. The international climbing community was watching too. This wasn't just about national pride anymore. It was about proving what women could accomplish in a sport dominated by male egos and testosterone-fueled decision-making. On August 4th, weather reports warned of an approaching storm. American teams already on the mountain reported whiteout conditions at 19,000 feet. Vitaly Abalakov, the base camp director and father of Soviet mountaineering, recommended that all teams return to base camp immediately. This wasn't some middle manager making a safety suggestion. This was a 68-year-old legend with more high-altitude experience than most climbers have years of life, telling people to get off the mountain now. But Elvira and her team were only 400 feet below the summit. They'd come so far, sacrificed so much, and the weather window was closing. Against all advice, they pushed for the summit. At 5 p.m. on August 5th, Elvira's voice crackled over the radio with triumph. "We made it. We are the first all-female team to reach the summit of Lenin Peak." The celebration lasted exactly as long as it took for them to realize they were trapped. The storm that hit Lenin Peak that night was later described as the worst in 25 years. Winds reached 160 kilometers per hour, that's 100 miles per hour, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees. The 8 women who just achieved their dream found themselves in a nightmare of biblical proportions, trapped on a narrow ridge at over 23,000 feet with nowhere to hide. What happened next was documented in real time through radio transmissions that are among the most heartbreaking records in mountaineering history. On August 6th, 80 mph winds tore their tents apart. A foot of snow buried their equipment. Elvira reported that one team member was violently ill, vomiting everything she tried to eat. Another was showing similar symptoms, the first signs of severe altitude sickness combined with hypothermia. Vitaly radioed desperately from base camp, telling them to abandon their position and dig snow caves for protection. He even told Elvira explicitly that if the sick team member couldn't be moved, they should leave her behind to save the others. But Elvira refused to abandon anyone. As they tried to descend, one woman was given a safety rope to anchor the others. She sat down to brace herself and never stood up again, the first to freeze to death on the side of the mountain. The surviving women managed to move only a few hundred feet before they couldn't go any further. The snow was too hard to dig protective caves, and they'd lost most of their equipment to the hurricane-force winds. They were forced to make camp again in completely inadequate shelter. That night, 2 more women died. Then the storm got worse. Hurricane-force winds slammed into the peak and ripped away nearly everything they had left. Tent poles snapped like twigs. Backpacks full of supplies became airborne and flew off the mountain. The 5 surviving women were reduced to 3 sleeping bags and a single canvas tent with no poles, flapping helplessly in some of the most extreme weather conditions ever recorded on Lenin Peak. By August 7th, Elvira reported that 3 of the 5 remaining women were sick. Only she and one other were still able-bodied, and they refused to abandon their dying teammates. Japanese climbers on the same route tried to ascend and help, but the wind was so strong they could barely stand upright, let alone climb. At noon that day, Elvira reported that 2 more had died. According to the radio transmissions, one woman's last words were asking when she would see flowers again. Another asked about her children. At 3:30 p.m., Elvira's voice was noticeably disoriented over the radio. She apologized for failing everyone. Vitaly pleaded with her to hold on, promising that rescue was coming, but they both knew it was impossible. At 5 p.m., With wind speeds reaching 100 miles per hour and temperatures at -40, Elvira transmitted what would become one of the most haunting final messages in mountaineering history. "I'm alone now with just a few minutes left. See you in eternity." Twice more in the following hours, someone pressed the radio transmit button, but no words came through. They were too weak to speak. When the weather finally cleared on August 8th, American climber Allen made his way toward the summit, thinking he might finally have his chance to climb. In the distance, he saw what looked like someone taking a nap in the sun. As he got closer, he recognized Elvira's distinctive coat and called out to her. She didn't move. When his team reached her, they discovered the trail of bodies, an entire team of women who had achieved their impossible dream, only to pay for it with their lives. The scene they found was like something from a frozen hell. Elvira had apparently tried to crawl down the mountain on her own at the very end. Above her, 4 more women were so tightly packed together where their tent had been that the 4th body wasn't found until a week later when recovery teams could pry them apart. Beyond that, the others formed a dotted line leading back to the summit, where the first woman to die still held the safety rope for her friends, an eternal, hopeless gesture of trying to save people who were already beyond saving. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. Elvira didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She'd already summited multiple mountains with women-only teams. She'd led dozens of expeditions. She was already a master of sport in the Soviet Union. Anyone who wasn't convinced of her abilities wasn't going to change their mind because of one more mountain. Sometimes being truly great at something requires a level of ego and ambition that can become self-destructive. That drive to always do more, to push further, to prove something that doesn't actually need proving. In 1975, her husband Vladimir led a recovery team up Lenin Peak to bring the bodies home. It's one of the few times in mountaineering history that such a dangerous recovery was attempted, but the Soviet government granted special permission after public outcry from families and citizens. All 8 women were recovered and reburied at the base of the mountain next to a monument that still stands today. And if you think the mountain had finished revealing its capacity for tragedy, you're wrong again. In August 2022, just 2 years ago, Lenin Peak claimed 2 more victims in a way that shows how something as simple as making tea can become deadly at altitude. Ilya had traveled from Moscow with his friend Zora to climb the mountain. Their guide had fallen ill, but they decided to continue anyway and met Vyacheslav Shiko, a local legend known for climbing in shorts and flip-flops. After Ilya injured his knee and had to turn back, Zora and Vyacheslav continued to the higher camps. When weather turned bad, they huddled in their tent and made a simple, fatal mistake. They lit a small burner to make tea and unzipped both the inner and outer tent layers for ventilation. But fresh snowfall blocked the airflow into the tent, slowly building up toxic levels of carbon monoxide while they waited for water to boil. Carbon monoxide poisoning is insidious. It dulls your mind and impairs judgment before putting you to sleep permanently. With bright sunlight filtering through the snow, they never noticed their tent flap was blocked. The 2 men weren't found until hours later, after their burner had run out of fuel. They died doing something as ordinary as making tea, killed by invisible gas in a tent that seemed perfectly safe. So what does all this mean? Why am I telling you about avalanches that bury camps in seconds, storms that trap climbers on summits for days, and carbon monoxide that kills silently in the night? Because Lenin Peak represents something fundamental about human nature and the mountains we choose to climb, literally and metaphorically. This mountain was considered safe. It had a reputation for being the beginner-friendly 7,000-meter peak, the training ground for Everest, the place where even amateur climbers could taste the death zone without actually dying. But that reputation killed more people than a mountain with a reputation for being deadly ever could. When we believe something is safe, we take risks we wouldn't normally take. We push where the windows we shouldn't push. We continue when we should retreat. Lenin Peak taught us that there's no such thing as a safe mountain above a certain altitude. The margin for error becomes so thin that a single earthquake hundreds of kilometers away can trigger an avalanche that kills 43 people in 10 seconds. A storm that's just slightly worse than predicted can trap 8 accomplished climbers on a summit until they freeze to death one by one. A blocked tent flap can fill your shelter with invisible poison while you're just trying to make tea. But here's what's really haunting about these stories. Every single person who died on Lenin Peak made reasonable decisions with the information they had. Elvira's team was experienced and well-equipped. The 1990 expedition was led by some of the most accomplished climbers in the Soviet Union. Zora and Vyacheslav were following standard cold-weather procedures. They weren't reckless amateurs. They were skilled mountaineers who encountered situations where skill alone wasn't enough. The real tragedy isn't that these people died. It's that they died pursuing something beautiful. The view from 23,000 feet isn't just about seeing far distances. It's about seeing clearly. At that altitude, with that much effort invested, with that much risk accepted, every breath of thin air feels like the most precious thing in the world. Every step toward the summit feels like a step toward understanding something fundamental about what humans can accomplish when we refuse to accept limitations. But the mountain doesn't care about our dreams, our achievements, or our need to prove ourselves. It just sits there, waiting, indifferent to whether we succeed or fail, live or die. And maybe that's the most important lesson Lenin Peak has to teach us. The mountains we choose to climb, whether they're made of rock and ice or ambition and ego, will always demand more than we think we can give. If this story has affected you, if you've ever pushed yourself beyond what felt safe in pursuit of something that mattered to you, drop the word summit in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories about the places where human ambition meets nature's indifference, make sure to subscribe because the mountains have many more secrets to reveal. The bodies of those who died on Lenin Peak remain there still, preserved in ice, eternal reminders that some dreams come with a price we can't imagine until we're asked to pay it. But they also remind us that the drive to climb higher, to go further, to prove that impossible things are possible, that drive is what makes us human, even when it kills us.